this movement is that it's actually being led by workers in precarious employment themselves. And so if you look at the movements around the world, in the U.S. and so forth, and in Ontario certainly, it's young, racialized women, racialized workers that are typically at the bottom of the economic heap in terms of wages, the structural barriers within the labor movement. And I think that's a very important aspect, because I'll tell us a little bit of the story of Ontario, that we launched our $14 campaign around the same time. We were all on the same wavelength, I think, so we kind of launched, when the $15 campaign launched in the US, we launched under the Fight for 14. And again, similarly, these demands for wages wasn't based on some economic formula or by discussions with academics in a university hall about what the appropriate level of the wages were. We actually talked to low-income workers and said, what would make you feel like fighting? And we pitched a bunch of, $20 an hour, $30 an hour, and the reality is people don't always feel confident, and if people don't feel like it's possible to win something, it matters. So even though $20 might be the living wage in Toronto, it wasn't something that people felt as though they could win. And so in the end, workers themselves said, $14 is what we feel we can fight for. This is what we will reorganize our lives for. And when we're talking about workers in precarious employment, it's a huge commitment to be politically active, to make all of those personal arrangements and so forth. And so our starting point always is what will motivate and give confidence to the workers who themselves must carry this fight forward. And that's also why and I'll just say we had a modest milestone around the campaign to raise the minimum wage. The wage had been frozen, the minimum wage had been frozen for almost 5 years. And we were able to get an increase from $10.25 an hour to $11 an hour. But also importantly, we won the political demand for indexation. And indexation is when the wages are adjusted every year to keep up with inflation. And that's important because that's actually a collective bargaining demand that has been in decline in our collective agreements in Ontario. And so reasserting the legitimacy of indexation as a fair and just measure to make sure wages keep up with cost of living increases is very important. And so on October 1st, the wage will be adjusted to $11.40 an hour. And again, that's an historic milestone that really matters because in Ontario, the minimum wage has been frozen for 12 of the last 20 years. Wow. So in other words, the wages are frozen. That's a cut in workers' incomes, basically, for 12 of 20 years. So winning indexation is very politically important. But because of the successes in the US, when workers struggle together, it makes people feel more confident and that their horizons can raise as well. And so with the movements in the United States, workers themselves felt that we can now ask for $15 an hour as well. And so on April 15th, 2015, we officially relaunched under the banner of 15 and fairness. And that allows us to be part of not only a North American movement, but a global movement to raise the employment standards floor. That was very important. But we also learned that you can't talk about wages without talking about all of the other things that contribute to decent work. And that's why workers themselves said paid sick days is absolutely critical, that every worker needs to be able to stay home and get well, and it's a healthcare matter. And in fact, this part of the campaign has allowed us to make alliances with healthcare providers in the province who themselves are seeing the impacts of terrible jobs in the hospital rooms, in the doctor's offices, and so forth. And so nurses and doctors and other health providers are standing up and speaking out and saying that actually employment standards, decent work is a healthcare issue, and we need to speak out for that. So that's been absolutely magnificent. The other thing that I think that's been very important to talk about in terms of this campaign is keeping it creative and finding new ways for allies to participate. And so for those of you who picked up leaflets and so forth, there's an aspect of the campaign almost for everyone, whether it's the right to join unions, because again, it's very important that workers are able to organize in their workplaces to make jobs better. Because I'm sure all around the world we're hearing the story of the rise of precarious employment. But we always have to remember that, you know, and we hear a lot about the loss of good jobs, the loss of good jobs. But we have to remember that before there were ever good jobs, there was bad jobs that workers struggled to make better. And the reason that we have good jobs in the first place is because there was struggles of workers to unionize, to demand proper laws, and so forth. And one of the things that we've found about actually focusing on legislation, it's a pathway toward unity, because so often, you know, if I've come from the labor movement, so often we're fighting for a good contract, but there's not a clear path to say to non-union workers, if you support us, you know, that'll help you. When we're not always very good at explaining how that exactly happens, and it doesn't even always translate, because we know the wages have been frozen for the last 20 years for non-union workers. So one of the things that fighting for legislation allows for us to do is to fight side by side, union and non-union worker together, to actually, and to think about legislation as our collective bargaining agreement for all the workers in the province. And if we think about that, we begin to think about building a united working class movement that can actually start giving employers, you know, a run for their money, and to raise the floor that will actually help unions organize. Because one of the things we're finding is that when, as others have noticed, when the wages are crumbling, when the benefits are crumbling, when no one has a pension and so forth, it makes it harder and harder for unionized workers to be able to sustain those standards. And so our slogan in Ontario has been that the working class together needs to raise the floor so that unions can set the bar. That we need a strong foundation for unions to be able to engage in collective bargaining. The laws, the human rights legislation that we have are all products of worker struggles that would not be there if it wasn't for us fighting together on those things. And for us, that's incredibly important. Now, we'll just quickly change gears and talk a little bit about the challenges, because of course, many of these things are easier said than done. And one of the things we're finding is that there's a huge audience for improvements in working conditions. If you talk to anybody, 8 out of 10 people are right with you. But how do we actually organize that sentiment? And right now, like finding those, you know, neighborhood committees, those workplace committees, those committees on the campuses, of people to find each other and do that heavy lifting of getting organized, getting mobilized, so that we can actually begin to make a difference. Because, and in Ontario, one of the other concessions we got from the minimum wage campaign is a commitment from the government to review all the legislation that affects workers in the province. So that's the Labour Relations Act, and that governs how unions are formed and how employers interact with unions, and the Employment Standards Act, which governs minimum standards. So this is a really important moment in Ontario to put everything on the table to make sure that those areas that are exempted from the laws, like, for example, there's no minimum wage for agricultural workers in Ontario because agricultural workers are exempted from all minimum standards in the legislation. It's absolutely scandalous, and there's so many exemptions to our legislation that it's virtually not there for the vast majority of workers. So we're saying end those exemptions, make sure everybody has those protections and so forth. And so finding ways to pull people into common activity. Airport workers have been inspired by the CTAG victory, where with different unions found that they didn't have the bargaining strength anymore to impose their vision on employers at the airport. So they too are coming together to improve their bargaining power and to link with the non-union workers and so forth. And now we're fighting for 15 and fairness at Pearson International Airport. And we're engaging the public, and we're on that campaign to do so. And students and workers are coming together on college and university campuses. We want 15 and fairness as minimum standards in every public sector workplace like universities, and it's something that students and workers can win together. And I was so inspired the other day to hear the comrades from South Africa tell about how students and workers together were able to win a major victory contracting in previously contracted out services. So I'll end by saying that we have incredible energy. We feel very optimistic, but employers are starting to organize this. You know, we must never forget the fights that everyone has had to have to make sure that the victories are victories. We need to be united for that. We need to have each other's back. I salute the old port workers of Montreal who are striking for 15 and fairness. unionization, I feel very energized myself. On the question of migrant workers, I'm going to put something out there quite bluntly, and that is migrant workers need status. They need to be part and parcel of our struggles, and if they are made to be more vulnerable because laws threaten to expel them the moment that they stand up and try to exercise their rights, then our movement is weakened. And actually, this is part of overcoming the fragmentation of the global workers' movement. We need to dispense with those artificial divisions like citizenship status and so forth. We need every worker active in the struggle, and migrant workers need status. And one of the things that we're doing, we're trying to fight to make sure that the exemptions in the labor laws are eliminated so that migrant workers have the same protections, so that they make $15, no tiers, no lower wages for younger people and so forth. Everybody in one struggle, one fight. That's very important. The second question I wanted to touch on is around the question of how do we build, how do we actually make this happen? And the truth of the matter is we are very lucky to have great politicians who will do the right things when they get elected, but they also need to be defended and supported because generally speaking, the business class has a lot of clout, and if they don't like the decisions that are being made by benevolent politicians, they're going to take their money and go elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera. And our forces, our numeric strength needs to be bigger than the fear of what the employers are going to do. Our movement needs to be bigger, stronger, better, faster, and more united, and that requires solidarity. And on that last question around unionization, it's a very interesting question. How is it that workers come to join unions? And certainly in Ontario, we have lots of debates around these things where it's like, workers can't struggle unless they have a union. Did you know you need a union? And so on and so forth. But what we're finding more and more is that when workers start to fight for better working conditions, they see unions as a tool in that struggle. That unions themselves are not the ends. Unions are a means to an end. Unions are a means to better working conditions. And when we bring union and non-union workers together, non-union workers want those things.